There is a specific, suffocating silence that falls over a house right before it spits you out. For 16-year-old Finley Montgomery, that silence smelled like lemon floor polish and his stepfather's expensive scotch. He stood on the porch with nothing but a garbage bag of wrinkled shirts, a soaking wet jacket, and a single, yellowed envelope tucked into his breast pocket. They threw him away like broken machinery. They thought he would freeze, beg, or simply disappear into the asphalt. But they didn't know about the letter, and they certainly didn't know that the grandfather they all called a lunatic had just handed Finley the keys to an empire. The storm had been brewing all afternoon, casting a bruised, purple twilight over the manicured lawns of Oakhaven. Finley Montgomery twisted the brass key in the front door of his home, or what used to be his home. The heavy mahogany door swung open, and before he could even kick off his soaked sneakers, he saw them. His stepfather, Richard Logan, stood in the center of the vaulted foyer. Richard was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. Today, it was a charcoal-tailored suit that looked entirely out of place for a Tuesday evening. Beside him stood Evelyn, Finley's mother. She was twisting a diamond tennis bracelet around her wrist, her eyes refusing to meet Finley's. At Richard's feet sat a heavy-duty black trash bag. "You're late," Richard said. His voice was a flat, emotionless drawl that grated against Finley's nerves. "Bus broke down on 4th Avenue, Finley replied, instinctively defensive. He looked at the trash bag, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. "What's going on? Are we donating clothes?" Evelyn let out a muffled sob and turned her face toward the wall. That was when the floor vanished from beneath Finley's feet. "We are making a change, Finley." Richard stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble. "Your mother and I have tolerated your presence, your insolence, and your abysmal academic performance for 3 years. But the incident at the school yesterday, that was the final straw. You are a liability to my firm's reputation, and frankly, a danger to this household." Finley's jaw dropped. "The incident? I defended a kid who was getting beaten up by your business partner's son. I didn't start the fight, Richard. I ended it." "You broke his jaw," Richard hissed, dropping the cool facade for a fraction of a second. "His father is sitting on the board of a merger that could net me $50 million, and you assaulted his heir. He was kicking a freshman in the ribs," Finley yelled, turning to his mother. "Mom, tell him. You saw the bruises on me. You know I was telling the truth." Evelyn finally looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but they held no warmth, only a terrifying, hollow resignation. "Finley, Richard thinks it's best if you learn some responsibility. You need to understand the real world. We can't have you here anymore." "You're kicking me out?" Finley's voice cracked. He was 16. He didn't even have a driver's license. "Mom, it's 40 degrees out there and raining. Where am I supposed to go?" "That is no longer our concern," Richard said smoothly, nudging the trash bag with his polished toe. "I've packed the essentials. No electronics. I paid for the phone, the laptop, and the gaming console, so they remain here. You have your clothes, a toothbrush, and $50 cash. Consider it a generous severance package." Panic, raw and jagged, clawed up Finley's throat. He stepped toward his mother, reaching out. "Mom, please, this is insane. I'm legally a minor. You can't just throw me on the street." Richard intercepted him, a heavy hand clamping onto Finley's shoulder with a bruising grip. "If you make a scene, I will call Sheriff Davies. He plays golf with me on Sundays." "Who do you think he'll believe? The respected investment banker, or the violent, delinquent teenager who just assaulted a classmate?" Finley stared into Richard's pale, merciless eyes. He saw the truth. This wasn't about a school fight. This was Richard finally excising the last piece of Finley's dead father from the house. Richard had wanted him gone since the wedding, and now he had his excuse. Finley looked at his mother one last time. She had turned her back entirely, her shoulders shaking silently. The betrayal was absolute. It burned worse than the physical pain of Richard's grip. "Fine," Finley spat, violently shoving Richard's hand away. "I wouldn't want to stain your precious marble anyway." He bent down and grabbed the plastic collar of the trash bag. As he did, Richard sneered. "Oh, before you leave, the Postal Service delivered this archaic piece of garbage today, addressed to you." Richard tossed a thick, yellowed envelope onto the floor. It landed with a soft smack next to Finley's wet shoes. Finley picked it up. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and unmistakably familiar. It was from Drew Montgomery, his paternal grandfather, the man the family claimed had lost his mind and vanished into the mountains 5 years ago. "Don't ever contact us," Richard commanded as Finley backed out the door. The heavy oak slammed shut, the deadbolt engaging with a heavy, metallic clack. Finley stood on the porch, the rain violently blowing under the awning, soaking him to the bone. He was 16. He was utterly alone. He shoved the heavy envelope into the inside pocket of his denim jacket, hoisted the trash bag over his shoulder, and stepped off the porch into the freezing downpour. The first 4 hours were a lesson in human invisibility. Finley walked from the affluent, gated limits of Oak Haven into the decaying industrial outskirts of Granton. The transition was stark. Manicured trees gave way to cracked sidewalks and flickering sodium streetlights that cast a sickly orange glow over the wet pavement. The cold was insidious. It bypassed his skin and settled deep into his bones. His sneakers were waterlogged, squishing with every step, and the trash bag dug painfully into his shoulder. Cars drove past, their tires hissing on the wet asphalt, but no one slowed down. To the world, he was just another stray wandering the night. By 11 p.m., exhaustion and near hypothermia forced him to seek shelter. He found it in the form of a neon sign buzzing furiously, its pink letters partially burnt out, so it read SYLIA's DNR. A bell jingled weakly as Finley pushed through the heavy glass door. The diner smelled of stale coffee, industrial bleach, and old grease, a combination that somehow felt incredibly welcoming. The place was mostly empty, save for a long-haul trucker asleep in a corner booth and a waitress wiping down the Formica counter. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Sylvia, looked up. Her eyes scanned his dripping clothes, his shivering frame, and the trash bag. She didn't scowl. Instead, she pointed a rag toward a booth near the back radiator. "Sit there. It's the warmest spot," she said, her voice rough like sandpaper but laced with undeniable pity. Finley slumped into the vinyl booth, his teeth chattering so hard his jaw ached. Sylvia appeared a minute later with a steaming mug of black coffee and a plate of leftover fries. "On the house?" she muttered. "Don't ask for a menu unless you've got cash to back it up." "Thank you," Finley whispered, his hands shaking so violently he had to hold the mug with both hands just to bring it to his lips. The scalding liquid sent a shock of life back into his system. Once the shivering subsided to a manageable tremor, Finley reached into his damp jacket. His fingers brushed against the thick, yellowed envelope. He pulled it out and set it on the dry portion of the table. The return address simply read, A. Montgomery, The Past. Finley swallowed hard. His grandfather, Drew, had been a towering figure in his childhood. A man who smelled of pipe, tobacco, and old books, who built intricate grandfather clocks and told Finley stories of hidden cities and buried kings. But after Finley's father died in a car accident, Drew changed. He became paranoid, ranting about thieves in suits and shadow ledgers. The family committed him, but he escaped a minimum security facility and was never seen again. Finley tore the envelope open. Inside were 2 items, a folded piece of heavy parchment and a heavy, jagged piece of dark metal. He picked up the metal first. It was a key, but not like any he had ever seen. It was forged from what looked like cast iron, heavy and cold, with a complex, almost geometric bit that looked like a jagged skyline. The bow of the key was engraved with an intricate emblem, a crow perched atop an hourglass. He unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was erratic but legible. "Finlay, if you are reading this, the vultures have finally shown their true colors. I warned your father about Evelyn's taste for shiny things, and I knew Richard Logan was a predator in a bespoke suit. I am sorry I could not be there to pull you from the wreckage. They think I went mad. They think the grief broke my mind. Let them believe it. Madness is the perfect camouflage for a man who knows too much. They wanted my estate, Finley. Richard married your mother not for love, but to get his hands on the Montgomery ledger. He failed. I liquidated everything before they could lock me up. The house, the stocks, the patents, all of it. The key in this envelope is the only thing that matters now. It belongs to box 404 at the First Merchants Bank of Granton. Inside that box is everything I managed to save from Richard's grasp, and the proof you need to understand what really happened to your father's brakes on the night he died. Do not trust the police. Do not trust your mother. Trust only the crow and the glass. Claim your birthright, boy. Make them bleed. Grandfather. Finley read the letter 3 times, his breath hitching in his throat. What really happened to your father's brakes? His father's death hadn't been an accident? Richard had been involved? The revelation hit Finley like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. The grief he had buried for 3 years flared up into a sudden, blinding rage. If Drew was telling the truth, Richard wasn't just a cruel stepfather. He was a murderer who had stolen Finley's life, his mother, and his home. Finley looked at the heavy iron key. First Merchants Bank of Granton. He pulled out the cheap, prepaid smartphone he had managed to buy a year ago with lawn-mowing money, a secret Richard didn't know about. He connected to the diner's weak Wi-Fi and typed First Merchants Bank of Granton into the search bar. The results loaded slowly. When they did, Finley's heart sank like a stone. The top article, dated 10 years ago, read, "Tragic Inferno Destroys First Merchants Bank. All vaults compromised in structural collapse." There were photos of a massive, historic building engulfed in roaring flames. Its roof caved in, leaving nothing but a smoldering shell. The bank didn't exist anymore. It had burned to the ground a decade ago. Drew had sent him a key to ashes. Finley leaned his head back against the cool vinyl of the booth, closing his eyes as a wave of utter despair washed over him. He was a homeless 16-year-old holding a piece of useless iron, chasing the delusions of a dead man. The morning sun did nothing to warm the bleak streets of Granton. Finley woke up stiff and aching in the diner booth. Sylvia had let him sleep, tossing a thin wool blanket over him at some point in the night. He left a $10 bill from his meager 50 on the table and slipped out before she could ask questions. He needed more cash. The remaining $40 wouldn't last him 3 days, let alone long enough to figure out what to do next. Digging into his trash bag in a damp alleyway, he found his father's old silver pocket watch. It was broken, the hands permanently frozen at 4:15, but the casing was solid, Logan silver. It broke his heart to part with it, but sentimentality was a luxury he could no longer afford. A few blocks down, he found a pawn shop wedged between a boarded-up liquor store and a discount shoe outlet. The sign read, "Finch's Golden Goods." The windows were barred with thick steel grates, and the displays were filled with dusty guitars, tarnished jewelry, and assorted electronics. A bell chimed harshly as Finley entered. The air smelled of old paper and cigar smoke. Behind the glass counter stood Gregory Finch, a gaunt man with thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a sharp, rodent-like face. He was appraising a gold chain with a jeweler's loop, barely glancing up as Finley approached. "We don't buy stolen bikes, kid," Finch rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushing together. "It's not a bike," Finley said, keeping his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He placed the silver pocket watch on the scratched glass counter. "It's solid, Logan. Late 19th century. I need cash." Finch finally looked up, his pale eyes sizing Finley up in an instant, taking in the damp clothes, the desperate posture, the trash bag. Easy prey. He picked up the watch, flipped it open, and scoffed. "Gears are shot. Casing is scratched. It's scrap weight. $20. "20?" Finley protested. "The silver alone is worth 80. Give me 50. 25. And that's charity," Finch countered, reaching under the counter to open his register. As Finley reached into his pocket to retrieve his ID, something Finch hadn't even asked for, further proving the man's shady nature, his fingers snagged on the heavy iron key. Without meaning to, he pulled it out along with his wallet. The dark metal clattered onto the glass counter, right next to the silver watch. The reaction was instantaneous. Finch froze. His hand hovered over the cash register drawer. Slowly, his eyes drifted down to the key. All the color drained from the pawnbroker's face. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He just stared at the emblem of the crow and the hourglass. "Where?" Finch swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Where did you get that?" Finley's instincts screamed at him. He quickly reached out and snatched the key, shoving it back into his pocket. "It's a family heirloom. Just give me the 25 for the watch." But Finch wasn't looking at the watch anymore. He looked at Finley, really looked at him, and his eyes darted to the locked front door. "That's a Blackwood key," Finch said, leaning over the counter. His demeanor entirely changed. He looked hungry and desperate. "You have no idea what you're holding, do you, boy?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Finley lied, grabbing his watch. "I changed my mind. I'm leaving." "Wait!" Finch shouted, lunging over the counter, his bony fingers grabbing Finley's wrist with surprising strength. "I'll give you $10,000 for it right now. Cash. No questions asked." $10,000. Finley's mind reeled. That was enough to rent an apartment, buy food, survive. But if a shady pawnbroker was offering 10 grand on the spot, the key was worth infinitely more. More importantly, it was the key to his grandfather's legacy. "Let go of me," Finley demanded, twisting his arm. "You can't use it anyway," Finch snarled, his grip tightening painfully. "You don't know where the doors are. They'll kill a kid like you for even holding it. Give it to me." Finch reached with his free hand toward Finley's pocket. Panic and adrenaline surged through Finley's veins. He used his momentum, stepping back and driving his elbow hard into Finch's forearm. The pawnbroker yelped in pain, his grip breaking. Finley didn't hesitate. He grabbed his trash bag and bolted for the door. "You're a dead man walking," Finch screamed from behind the counter, rubbing his arm. "If I recognized it, the hounds will too. You hear me? They'll find you." Finley burst through the door, hitting the street running. He sprinted for 3 blocks, his lungs burning, constantly checking over his shoulder to see if Finch was following. He wasn't. Finley ducked into a narrow alleyway, leaning against the cold brick wall, gasping for air. He pulled the heavy iron key out of his pocket, staring at it with new, terrified eyes. A Blackwood key. Finch hadn't mentioned the First Merchants Bank. He had called it Blackwood. Finley needed a safe place to think. He remembered passing a large, imposing public library a few streets over. It was a public space, warm, and had free computer access. He fast walked there, keeping his head down, every shadow suddenly looking like a threat. The Granton Public Library was a sanctuary of dust and quiet. Finley secured a terminal in the furthest corner of the reference section. He sat down, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He typed in, "Blackwood Trust Granton." Nothing. No businesses, no news articles, no directory listings. He thought about his grandfather's letter. Paranoia. Shadow ledgers. Madness is camouflage. Drew had dealt with people who operated off the grid. Finley modified his search. He looked up the articles about the First Merchants Bank fire from 10 years ago. He read past the headlines, digging into the dry, bureaucratic details of the aftermath. He found a small, digitized clipping from a local financial gazette buried on page 14. Following the catastrophic loss of the First Merchants superstructure, the bank's subterranean vault network, which remained entirely intact, has been acquired in a private auction by a holding company known as Blackwood Logistics. The vaults will reportedly be sealed and repurposed for private, off-the-books asset storage for international clients. The facility has no public storefront. Finley leaned closer to the monitor, his heart hammering against his ribs. The bank hadn't burned down. Only the building above it had. The vaults and Box 404 were still there, buried deep beneath the city, operating under a new name for people who didn't want their money tracked. His grandfather hadn't sent him a key to Ashes. He had sent him a key to the underworld, and according to Finch, holding this key put a massive target on Finley's back. Richard had thrown him to the wolves, but Drew had just handed him a weapon. Finley closed the browser, the terror in his chest slowly crystallizing into a cold, hard resolve. He was going to find the Blackwood Trust. He was going to open Box 404, and he was going to destroy Richard Logan. The ruins of the First Merchants Bank sat in the center of Granton's financial district, an ugly scar of flat concrete and chain-link fencing surrounded by towering glass skyscrapers. The city had turned it into a temporary parking lot, completely unaware that billions of dollars in illicit wealth shifted hands just 50 feet beneath the asphalt. Finley stood across the street, huddled under the awning of a closed newsstand. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. He studied the lot. There were no obvious entrances, no heavily guarded doors, just a man in a neon vest waving cars through an electronic boom gate. Finch wasn't lying. A voice rasped from the shadows to Finley's left. Finley jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. Two men had boxed him in. They didn't look like street thugs. They wore tailored navy overcoats, their postures rigidly military, their eyes scanning the street with cold efficiency. The man who had spoken had a jagged scar running from his earlobe to his collar. These were the hounds. "You're the stray who brought a Blackwood artifact into a pawn shop?" the scarred man said, taking a slow step closer. He casually unbuttoned his coat, revealing the dark, matte grip of a holstered pistol. "Hand it over, kid. You don't want to die in a puddle." Panic seized Finley's muscles. He looked left, blocked. He looked right. The second hound was already reaching out to grab him. Finley did the only thing he could. He dropped the heavy trash bag right onto the second man's polished shoes, throwing him off balance, and shoved past him with all his body weight. "Hey!" the man barked, stumbling into the newsstand. Finley ran. He sprinted blindly down an alleyway, vaulting over a rusted dumpster, his lungs burning with the icy air. He could hear their heavy footsteps echoing behind him, calm, paced, and relentless. They weren't sprinting, they were hunting. He took a sharp right down a narrow passage that smelled of rotting produce and stagnant water. It was a dead end. A towering brick wall loomed before him. He was trapped. Finley spun around, pressing his back against the cold brick, bracing himself as the two hounds turned the corner, drawing their weapons. Suddenly, a heavy steel door to Finley's right one he hadn't even noticed, blended into the brickwork, slammed open. A hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar of his denim jacket, and yanked him backward into the pitch-black interior. The door slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang, followed by the heavy thud of 3 deadbolts sliding into place. "Quiet," a voice hissed in the dark. Finley pressed his hands against his mouth to muffle his heavy breathing. Outside, he heard the hounds swearing, kicking the steel door, and eventually, their footsteps fading away as they split up to search the perimeter. A single overhead bulb flickered to life, revealing a cramped basement workshop cluttered with clock parts, blueprints, and empty coffee cans. Standing in front of Finley was an old man with wild silver hair, wearing a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit. His left hand was missing the pinky and ring fingers. "You've got your grandfather's eyes," the old man grunted, picking up a rag to wipe grease from his good hand, "and his terrifying talent for attracting the worst people in Granton." You knew Drew?" Finley stammered, stepping away from the heavy door. "Knew him? I built half the things that man dreamed up," the old man said, extending his 3-fingered hand. "Silas Whitaker. I was Drew's apprentice, until they dragged him off to that asylum." Silas pointed a greasy wrench at Finley's pocket. "I know why they're chasing you. Finch, put the word out on the wire. A kid with the crow and hourglass. Let me see it." Hesitantly, Finley pulled the heavy iron key from his pocket and handed it over. Silas handled it with a reverence bordering on religious. He ran his thumb over the intricate, jagged bit. "Magnificent," Silas whispered. "Drew designed the subterranean vaults for Blackwood Logistics. It was his final commission before his mind started to unravel. He built their impenetrable doors, and in return, they gave him Box 404. It's a bearer account." "What does that mean?" Finley asked. "It means Blackwood demands absolute anonymity. There are no names tied to the vaults, no passwords, no facial recognition, only the key. Whoever holds the key owns the box," Silas explained, handing it back to Finley. "But if a street kid is holding a Blackwood master key, the hounds assume you stole it. They'll kill you to return it to the rightful owner." "I need to get into that vault, Silas," Finley said, his voice hardening. He was done being a victim. Drew left something in there. Proof of what Richard Logan did to my father. Silas froze, his eyes widening. He stared at Finley for a long, silent moment, then let out a heavy sigh. Richard Logan, that slick, corporate parasite. I always told Drew that man was a snake in the grass. "So, you're going to burn him down?" "I'm going to destroy him," Finley stated. Silas smiled, a grim, toothy grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Good. The front door is suicide, but I helped pour the concrete for the drainage systems around the vault. There's a maintenance access hatch in the subway tunnels. It'll get you into the Blackwood lobby. After that, boy, you're on your own. The descent was a nightmare of damp concrete, scurrying rats, and the echoing roar of subterranean trains. Silas led Finley deep into the abandoned sections of the Granton subway system, navigating a maze of maintenance shafts until they reached a dead-end tunnel blocked by a massive, rusted grate. Silas quickly disengaged a hidden latch, swinging the heavy grate open. Beyond it was a pristine, brushed steel door. It looked entirely alien in the filthy, crumbling sewer. "This is the service entrance for the atmospheric scrubbers," Silas whispered, checking his watch. "The automated shift change for the lobby guards happens at 2 a.m. That's in 4 minutes. You go through here, walk down the corridor, and you'll merge right into the client lobby." Finley nodded, his stomach doing flips. "Thank you, Silas." "Don't thank me yet, kid. Just remember, walk with purpose. Blackwood clients are billionaires, cartel bosses, and oligarchs. If you act like you belong, the guards won't question the bearer of a key. You show fear, they'll shoot you." Silas gripped Finley's shoulder. "Make Drew proud." Finley stepped through the steel door. It clicked shut behind him, sealing off the damp smell of the sewers. Instantly, the air became perfectly climate-controlled, smelling of ozone and expensive cologne. He walked down a short, brightly lit corridor and pushed through a set of double-swinging doors. He stepped into the Blackwood Trust. It was breathtaking. The lobby was a vast, subterranean cathedral of black marble, gold trim, and armored glass. Men and women in bespoke suits sat in plush leather chairs, sipping champagne, while armed guards in tactical gear stood silently at the perimeter. Finley's damp, wrinkled clothes and scuffed sneakers made him stick out like a sore thumb. A guard near the entrance immediately rested his hand on his holster, his eyes narrowing as he stepped toward Finley. "Walk with purpose," Silas's voice echoed in his head. Finley didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy iron key, and held it up so the overhead lights caught the crow and hourglass emblem. The guard stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted from the key to Finley's face, a flicker of confusion crossing his features, but he immediately stepped back and bowed his head slightly. The key was absolute law down here. Finley walked straight toward the massive teller desk, manned by a man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo behind 3 inches of bulletproof glass. Finley slid the key under the transaction slot. "Box 404. The teller examined the key, his professional smile faltering for a microsecond before he regained his composure. "Of course. Right this way, sir." A heavily armored door behind the desk hissed open. Finley followed the teller down a long, spiraling corridor lined with thousands of brushed steel deposit boxes. They stopped at the very end of the hall, in front of a heavy vault door that looked like it belonged on a nuclear bunker. "Insert the key and turn counterclockwise, sir," the teller instructed, stepping back to give Finley privacy. Finley slid the heavy iron key into the slot. It fit perfectly. He turned it. A series of heavy, mechanical clunks echoed from deep within the door, Drew's intricate clockwork mechanisms disengaging. The massive steel door swung outward with a soft hiss of escaping air. Finley stepped into the private viewing room and pulled the heavy metal drawer from the wall. He carried it to the mahogany table in the center of the room and threw open the lid. Inside were 3 things. First, neatly stacked rows of bearer bonds. Finley didn't know much about high finance, but the numbers printed on them were staggering. Each bundle was worth $1 million. There were at least 20 bundles. Second, a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Third, a sleek, black USB drive, resting on top of a folded piece of stationery. Finley's hands trembled as he picked up the note. It was in his grandfather's handwriting. "The money is for your future. The ledger tracks every cent. Richard Logan embezzled from the Chicago syndicate. Give it to the FBI, and Richard goes to prison for fraud. Give it to the syndicate, and Richard doesn't live out the week. But the drive, Finley, the drive is for you." Finley turned to the secure computer terminal sitting on the desk. He plugged in the USB drive. A single audio file popped up on the screen. He clicked play. The audio was scratchy, recorded covertly. Finley instantly recognized Richard's smooth, arrogant drawl. The brake lines need to fail at high speed, no half measures. If Thomas makes it to the SEC on Monday, I go away for 20 years. A gruff, unfamiliar voice replied, "It's done, Mr. Logan. But what about the wife? She's bound to ask questions if he crashes." There was a long pause on the recording. Then, the sound of paper sliding across a desk. "Evelyn won't be a problem," Richard said. "Read the note. She knows what has to be done to protect our lifestyle. She gave me the green light this morning." The recording clicked off. Finley stared at the black screen, his reflection staring back at him. The air was sucked out of his lungs. His vision blurred as a sickening, heavy weight crushed his chest. She gave me the green light, his mother, his own mother knew. Evelyn had allowed Richard to murder her husband Finley's father so she wouldn't lose her mansion, her tennis bracelets, her comfortable life. That was why she couldn't look at Finley when Richard threw him out. He wasn't just a nuisance to her. He was the living, breathing reminder of the man she had conspired to murder. A tear tracked through the grime on Finley's cheek, but he wiped it away viciously. The sorrow was gone, instantly incinerated by a rage so pure and blinding it made his hands shake. He wasn't a scared, homeless teenager anymore. He was the heir to Drew Montgomery's vengeance. Suddenly, the screen on the terminal flashed violently red. A klaxon alarm began to blare, echoing off the steel walls of the vault room. "Unauthorized presence detected. Sector 4. Lockdown initiated." Finley spun around just as the heavy vault door began to swing shut on its own. He lunged for it, but he was a second too late. The magnetic locks engaged with a bone-rattling boom. He was locked inside. A small speaker above the door crackled to life. It wasn't the teller, it was the scarred hound from the alleyway. "We've got you, kid," the hound's voice echoed with cruel satisfaction. "And you'll be thrilled to know that your stepfather, Mr. Logan, was notified the moment that Key entered the lock. He's a very valued client of ours. He's on his way down right now to personally handle the trespasser." The silence that followed the hound's announcement was heavier than the steel walls closing Finley in. He stood alone in the center of Vault 404, the metallic chill of the room seeping through the thin soles of his wet sneakers. His stepfather was coming. The man who had orchestrated the murder of his father and discarded him like garbage was on his way down to the underworld. Finley's eyes darted around the room. It was a perfect, impenetrable box, 10 feet by 10 feet of solid, reinforced titanium and concrete. There were no ventilation grates large enough to crawl through, no drop ceilings, no secondary doors. It was a tomb. He looked down at the mahogany table, the millions in bearer bonds, the damning black USB drive, and the heavy leather ledger sitting there like a morbid buffet. If Richard found these, it wouldn't just be the end of Finley's quest for justice. It would be the end of his life. Richard would never let him walk out of this bank knowing the truth. Panic threatened to paralyze him, but a memory surfaced, cutting through the fear. Silas's voice in the basement. Drew designed the subterranean vaults. He built their impenetrable doors, and in return, they gave him Box 404. Drew Montgomery was a master clockmaker, an engineer of the obsessive and paranoid variety. He believed in shadow ledgers and hidden thieves. A man like that wouldn't build a cage he couldn't open from the inside. He wouldn't design a vault without a back door, especially if it was his vault. Finley rushed to the massive steel door. The inside panel was smooth, save for a large, circular rotary wheel used to seal the pressure locks manually. There was no keyhole on the interior. "Think," Finley muttered to himself, his breath pluming in the cold, climate-controlled air. He pulled the heavy iron key from his pocket, the crow and the hourglass. He ran his fingers over the intricate, jagged bit of the key. It wasn't just designed to push pins in a lock. The teeth were angled, almost like gears. He looked back at the mahogany table in the center of the room. It was bolted to the floor. Why bolt a table in a secure vault? Finley lunged toward the table. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain as they slammed against the concrete. He shined his burner phone's flashlight under the thick wooden pedestal. There, hidden in the dark recess of the table's base, was a small, circular indentation. It was a perfect match for the bow of the key, the crow, and the hourglass. Finley shoved the top of the key into the indentation. It clicked into place. He twisted it hard to the right. A deep, mechanical groan reverberated through the floorboards. The heavy mahogany table slowly split down the middle, the two halves sliding apart on hidden tracks. Beneath it, a dark, narrow chute was revealed, with a metal ladder bolted to the side, descending into absolute blackness. Drew's escape hatch. Suddenly, the red lights above the main vault door flashed green. The magnetic locks disengaged with a terrifyingly loud thud. The heavy door began to hiss open. Finley didn't have a second to spare. He grabbed the black USB drive and shoved it deep into his front pocket. He snatched the heavy leather ledger, tucking it tightly under his arm. He looked at the stacks of bearer bonds. He couldn't take them all, they were too bulky. He grabbed 3 stacks, $3 million, and stuffed them into his jacket, zipping it up to his chin. Well, well, well. A smooth, arrogant voice echoed into the vault. Finley froze, half his body already descended into the hidden chute. Richard Logan stood in the doorway. He was flanked by the scarred Hound, Briggs, and 2 other armed Blackwood guards. Richard was dressed impeccably in a midnight blue tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. He looked like he had just stepped away from a gala, completely unbothered by the fact that he was about to dispose of his stepson. "I must admit, Finley, I am thoroughly impressed," Richard said, taking a slow sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the open safety deposit box on the wall, then drifting down to Finley, who was suspended in the floor. "I spent 3 years searching Drew's estate for that key. I tore up his floorboards, interrogated his lawyers, bribed his nurses, and all along, the crazy old bat mailed it to you." Richard stepped into the room, his leather shoes clicking against the floor. "And what a clever little rat hole you've found. Unfortunately, it ends here." "You murdered him," Finley said, his voice surprisingly steady, echoing up from the chute. "I know about the brake lines. I know you paid someone to kill my father." Richard's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes hardening into chips of flint. He glanced back at the guards. "Wait outside. Briggs, stay." The regular guards retreated, and the heavy door remained open just enough for Briggs to stand watch. "You found Drew's delusions," Richard sneered, stepping closer to the edge of the chute. The old man was insane. "Whatever scraps of paper you found down here are the ravings of a lunatic." "It's not paper," Finley lied smoothly, patting the pocket where the USB was hidden. "It's a recording, you and the mechanic. And Mom." Richard went perfectly still. The silence in the vault was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was a venomous whisper. "Give it to me, now." "Or what?" Finley challenged, his grip tightening on the metal rung of the ladder. "You'll have your dogs shoot me?" "If I die, Silas Whitaker sends copies of this recording to every news station in the state." It was a bluff, but Finley delivered it with every ounce of conviction he possessed. Richard's jaw clenched. "You're a child playing a very dangerous adult game. You have no idea who I work with, Finley. Give me the drive, and I will let you walk away tonight. I'll even let you keep whatever cash you've stuffed in your jacket. A fresh start. Isn't that what you want?" "I want you to burn," Finley said. Before Richard could signal Briggs, Finley let go of the top rung and slid down the ladder into the darkness. He hit the bottom of the chute with a heavy thud, his sneakers splashing into an inch of stagnant water. "Briggs, get down there!" Richard roared from above. Finley looked up. The opening of the chute was 20 feet above him. He reached up and felt along the damp concrete wall until his fingers brushed against a heavy iron lever, Drew's failsafe. As Briggs's heavy boots began to clatter down the metal rungs, Finley yanked the lever down with all his body weight. A deafening explosion of pneumatic pressure echoed through the chute. Above him, the 2 halves of the mahogany table slammed shut with the force of a hydraulic press. Briggs managed to pull his legs up just in time, yelping as the heavy wood clamped together, sealing the chute completely. Finley was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. But he wasn't trapped, he was free. He turned on his phone's flashlight, illuminating a narrow, brick-lined tunnel that smelled of old river water and rust. He started running. The icy, polluted water of the Granton River felt like 1,000 rusted knives slicing into Finley's skin as he finally dragged himself onto the muddy embankment. He collapsed onto the reeds, his lungs burning and his limbs trembling violently from the adrenaline crash and the sheer, biting cold. He was covered in toxic sludge and shivering so hard his teeth clicked together, but he refused to let go of his cargo. Clutched tightly against his soaked chest, wrapped securely inside his denim jacket, were the heavy leather ledger, the black USB drive, and the stacks of high-denomination currency he had snagged from the vault's emergency cash drawer alongside the million-dollar bonds. He forced himself to his feet. Staying still meant freezing to death. For 3 agonizing miles, Finley stumbled along the darkened, deserted highway shoulder, jumping into the thorny roadside ditches every time a pair of headlights swept through the rain. He didn't know if Richard's hounds were tracking him, but he wasn't going to take any chances. By the time the glowing, neon oasis of the Crossroads 24/7 truck haven appeared through the mist, Finley was running on pure survival instinct. The massive parking lot was a sea of idling 18-wheelers. He bypassed the main entrance, slipping instead through the side doors near the diesel pumps. The blast of artificial heat inside the convenience store hit him like a physical wall, nearly buckling his knees. He ducked into the expansive men's room, locking himself in a handicap stall. Peeling off his ruined jacket, he meticulously dried the ledger and the drive with rough paper towels. From his pocket, he pulled a thick stack of $100 bills. He had never held this much money in his life. After purchasing a cheap grey hoodie, a pair of dry sweatpants, and a rugged canvas backpack from the trucker supply aisle, Finley found an empty booth in the far corner of the attached diner. He ordered a black coffee, paying a suspicious waitress with a crisp 100 and telling her to keep the change. The generosity bought her silence. Next, he walked over to a glass display case near the register, selling refurbished electronics, and bought a bulky, outdated laptop for $300 cash. Returning to his booth, Finley opened the heavy leather ledger. Drew Montgomery's brilliance was undeniably breathtaking. It wasn't just a list of numbers, it was a beautifully intricate map of Richard Logan's deceit. Drew had meticulously documented every wire transfer, every offshore shell corporation in the Caymans, and every falsified invoice Richard had used to siphon exactly $14,250,000 from the Salvatore Rossi crime syndicate operating out of Chicago. Richard believed his Ivy League education made him smarter than the mob. Drew's ledger proved he was just a dead man walking. Finley purchased a heavy-duty padded shipping envelope from the clerk. He pulled a piece of truck stop stationery from a display rack and grabbed a pen. His hand shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He wrote a brief, damning note. Don Rossi, attached is the shadow ledger for the Blackwood Trust accounts managed by your banker, Richard Logan. He has been systematically stealing from your organization for 4 years. The exact amount is $14.2 million. The proof is in the math. A friend of the house. He sealed the note and the ledger inside the envelope, carefully addressing it to the seemingly legitimate meatpacking company Silas had mentioned was the Rossi family's primary front. He dropped it into the overnight courier box outside the diner. Returning to his laptop, Finley connected to the public, unencrypted Wi-Fi. He plugged in the black USB drive. He didn't just send the audio file of Richard and his mother to the local police. Richard had the sheriff in his pocket. Instead, Finley attached the recording to a mass email directed to the FBI's regional field office, the state district attorney, and the investigative news desks of the top 3 broadcast networks in the country. He titled the email, Confession and Conspiracy, the Murder of Thomas Montgomery. Finley hovered his finger over the trackpad. This was the point of no return. Once he clicked it, his mother's life, and everything he had ever known, would be incinerated. He closed his eyes, heard his father's laugh one last time in his memory, and pressed down, send. A massive, crushing weight instantly lifted off his chest. The ghost of his father, which had haunted the halls of Oakhaven for 3 agonizing years, finally felt at peace. 2 days later, Finley sat on a worn, velvet Victorian couch in Silas Whitaker's underground workshop. The air smelled of machine oil, strong espresso, and soldering iron smoke. A small, static-filled television was perched precariously on a workbench, humming with the morning news. "Turn it up, kid," Silas grunted, wiping a thick layer of grease from his 3-fingered hand. Finley grabbed the remote, his heart hammering against his ribs. A polished news anchor stared somberly into the camera, a graphic reading, Oakhaven scandal hovering beside her. We have breaking news this morning out of the affluent community of Oakhaven. Prominent investment banker Richard Logan has been reported missing under highly suspicious circumstances. Federal authorities arrived at the Logan estate before dawn today with a grand jury indictment for his arrest regarding newly surfaced explosive audio evidence in the death of Thomas Montgomery. However, the mansion was completely abandoned by Mr. Logan. The broadcast cut to live helicopter footage of the sprawling Oakhaven estate. The massive mahogany front doors were wide open. A dozen federal cruisers flashed their red and blue lights across the manicured lawn. While Richard Logan remains a fugitive, authorities did make an arrest at the property, the anchor continued, her voice turning grim. Evelyn Logan, wife of the missing banker, has been taken into federal custody, facing charges of conspiracy to commit murder. The footage shifted to a ground-level camera. Evelyn, wearing a silk designer dressing gown and looking utterly hollowed out, was being escorted out of the house in heavy steel handcuffs. She looked terrified, scanning the crowd of reporters as if looking for someone to save her. Finley watched his mother being shoved into the back of an armored FBI vehicle. A tight, painful knot formed in his throat. A lingering ghost of the little boy who used to hold her hand cried out, mourning the mother he thought he had. But that sorrow was quickly overshadowed by the cold, unyielding reality of her choices. She had traded his father's life for marble floors and diamond bracelets. Now, the bill had finally come due. "Missing?" Finley asked, his voice barely a whisper, turning to look at the old mechanic. "Did he manage to run?" Silas let out a dark, raspy chuckle, shaking his head slowly. "Men who steal $14 million from Salvatore Rossi don't get the luxury of running, Finley. The hounds at Blackwood might be tough, but the Chicago outfit owns the shadows in this city." Once Rossi opened that envelope, Richard ceased to exist. He's a ghost. He's probably resting at the bottom of Lake Michigan right now, wearing a very expensive pair of concrete shoes. Finley leaned back against the velvet cushions. He reached into his canvas backpack and pulled out the thick bundles of bearer bonds and the stacks of $100 bills. He had millions of dollars sitting casually on his lap. "So," Silas said, leaning against his workbench and crossing his arms, a look of profound respect in his weathered eyes, "you've successfully avenged your father. You've utterly destroyed the monsters who threw you out into the rain. You're 16 years old, legally emancipated by abandonment, and holding enough untraceable wealth to buy a tropical island. What exactly is a kid like you going to do now?" Finley looked around the dark, cluttered, and perfectly safe walls of the subterranean workshop. He thought about Oakhaven, the suffocating silence, and the people who wore masks of civility while hiding rotting, monstrous hearts. He never wanted to step foot in the sunlit world of high society ever again. He looked at the gruff, three-fingered mechanic who had risked his own life for a homeless stray. "I think," Finley said, a genuine, unburdened smile finally touching his lips for the first time in 3 years, "I want to learn how to build clocks. And maybe, if you have the time, you can teach me how to crack open the rest of those underground vaults." Silas's eyes lit up with a dangerous, delighted gleam. He reached into his toolbox and tossed a heavy silver wrench through the air. Finley caught it perfectly. "Put the money away, apprentice," Silas grinned. "We've got work to do." If you found yourself holding your breath during Finley's descent into the shadow bank, or cheering when Richard finally met his match, then you know this isn't just a story, it's a masterclass in karma. We pour our hearts into bringing you these high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled tales of revenge, resilience, and the triumph of the underdog. If you want to see more thrilling stories where the forgotten strike back and the corrupt get exactly what they deserve, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next gripping upload. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you found the Crow and Hourglass key? Let us know, and we'll see you in the next story.